Hello, my name is Deborah Dwork, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second semester of a year-long virtual series on the subject of refugees and forcibly displaced persons. Offered in the midst of a global refugee crisis, our series examines historical and contemporary cases, laying bare underlying patterns, illuminating unknown aspects, and suggesting paths forward. I thank our partner institution, NYU's Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, and most particularly, Professor Marian Kaplan, who has been my partner in this initiative. Thanks too to Center Associate Juan Acevedo, to the GC's super IT people, Brad Holshore and John Genesi, and to the Center's terrific advisory board. A special shout out to Doctors Eli Karetny and Michael Ekstrom for their work behind the scenes. I am delighted to say that our event today is held in association with the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program, Outreach Division, Department of Global Communications at the United Nations. My colleague, Dr. Tracy Peterson, director of the program, will say a few words shortly, but I claim the floor for another 2 minutes to introduce our subject and speakers. This semester, we will investigate the meaning of home. We begin with an examination of the prompts for and problems of repatriation. What prompted Viennese Jews to return to their home city after the devastation of the Holocaust? What were their hopes, and what did they find? Dr. Elizabeth Anthony investigates these questions in her new book, The Compromise of Return, finalist for the Ernst Fraenkel Prize. And the renowned historian Albert Lichtblau, who has been key to preserving, analyzing, and understanding survivor testimony, will serve as talk show host, investigating Elizabeth Anthony. There is much to say about both scholars, so I will be short to avoid going long. And as I know both, I will revert to first name usage with all respect to their titles. Betsy Anthony is the director of Visiting Scholars Programs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. The Compromise of Return was co-published by Wayne State University Press and the USHMM in 2021. Betsy is now on to her next project, a study of that rare demographic group, elderly Jewish survivors in Vienna. Albert Lichtblau served as chair of the Center for Jewish Cultural History and of the History Department at the University of Salzburg. Dedicated to the study of history as applied history, he initiated projects relevant to the public. One of these was to record survivors' oral histories and to make them accessible to all. The Lichtblau collection, Oral History Interviews with Victims of National Socialism at Austria's Media Library, was included in the UNESCO Documentary Heritage Memory of the World program in 2018. And now I turn to Dr. Peterson. Tracy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Deborah. And it is my pleasure to add my words of welcome to all of you to Deborah's. In 2005, the United Nations General Assembly designated the 27th of January the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust, and established the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program, mandating the program to further Holocaust education and remembrance as a contribution to preventing genocide. We work across society and across borders, amplifying best practice and providing spaces for civil society groups, educators, students, institutions of learning to engage and learn. We are indeed enriched by our association with the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity, the Graduate Center CUNY, and the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, NYU. Today's discussion resonates particularly with our program, as we, with the scholarly guidance of Professor Dwork, have created an exhibition called After the End of the World, Displaced Persons and Displaced Persons Camps. The exhibition looks at the period immediately following the end of the Second World War and draws on sources from the UN Archives and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research Archive to illuminate both the steps taken by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the first attempt to coordinate a multinational response to the humanitarian crisis brought on by the war, and the agency and responses of the Holocaust survivors who came to be in the displaced persons camps. COVID restrictions have meant that we will only be able to display the exhibition in January 2023, and I sincerely look forward to welcoming you all at United Nations headquarters then. And now it is my pleasure to hand over to Professor Albert Lichtblau and Dr. Elizabeth Anthony.
Thank you so much for the kind introductions. I try to be a talk show host. This is new for me. I'm very impressed by the number of participants, but don't forget there's a Q&A possibility to raise questions, and we will have 15 minutes for discussions, and I hope we can cover it. Before I start my discussion with Betsy, I just want to give you a short introduction on the book and on Vienna. Maybe not everybody is familiar with the situation in Vienna, and you should be aware that Vienna was a very important Jewish European city during the Habsburg monarchy. So in 1923, there were more than 200,000 Jews in Vienna. This was approximately 11% of the whole population. And something else is important about Austria: 90% of all Jews lived in Vienna. So it was a very metropolitan population. This has to do with the book as well, because Vienna became so important. So Betsy's book focuses on remigration, but not only on remigration, because it's embedded in Austrian post-war policy, in activities of the Allies. She refers to the Cold War. And I just try to make it short, though, that we can go into details later. She focuses on certain broad patterns about four groups mainly. The first one are those who survived in hiding, called U-Boote, submarines. I don't know if this doesn't translate sensibly. So approximately 800 people survived in hiding. Then those who came back to Vienna from the camps. So until the end of 1945, these were approximately 1,700, mainly from Theresienstadt. Then the remigrees from other countries, United Kingdom, and also other countries like the States. At the beginning, they were very politically motivated communist social democrats, but there were other reasons. And the fourth group she focuses on the professionals, like, they couldn't make a living in the other countries because they studied law, and you cannot transfer it to other countries, or they were writers and referred to their German language, or doctors and so on. So this is, I tried to give you a broad, insight about the books, the groups that are covered in Betsy's book. And so this was a short, hopefully sensible moment for everybody to know a little bit about the situation there. Betsy, as an Austrian, I'm always interested. What is the interest of an American scholar to do exactly this work on Austrian Jews, on Austria as well? And I just want to ask you about your motivations. And I'm aware when you start a project like this, you have an idea at the beginning and it changes a lot over the time. So can you give us a little bit insight about, the changing of your approaches and methods and sources? And why does the book look like it looks like now?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Albert, for agreeing to do this and for the question. And it's a good way to start. I worked for years with survivors in the United States in the late 90s, early 2000s. And in 2004, I moved to Vienna, where I became involved a bit with the Jewish community. In particular, I volunteered at the Jewish nursing home in Vienna, supposedly to practice my German. And, to have some continuation from my life and work in the United States with survivors and making touch with the Jewish community. So as I said, I wanted to volunteer. I wanted to help out at the Viennese Zentrum, the Jewish nursing home in Vienna, and also practice my German, and learned immediately that this was a bit naive because from the moment I set foot in the Viennese Zentrum, no one permitted me to speak one word of German. Of course, so many elderly Viennese Jews, and most of them, those that I was meeting, so many of them spent the war in Palestine or in the UK or in the US, and they all spoke English very, very well. Some of them reminded me that they actually spoke British English and therefore better English than I. But even so, they wanted an opportunity to speak English, so they would speak with an American anyway. And so this intended participation in Singenstunde and arts and crafts auf Deutsch quickly transformed into me leading an English tisch, something I did for years, every Tuesday. And, this led to my focus and my questions. All of my work prior to moving to Vienna had been with survivors and their families, but they were survivors in the United States. They had emigrated, obviously. They didn't go home, or at least they didn't stay there if they had gone home originally. I know that I'd known intellectually that some Jews had gone back to their European hometowns, but I don't know that I really realized it, maybe on an emotional level, until I was there and meeting elderly Viennese Jews. And so these questions emerged. Why did they come back? What motivated them? What did they expect? What did they encounter? And why did they stay? And it really, I have to say, I just have to add it, I think it really clicked for me as a research question I wanted to pursue a bit later when I met with survivors back in the US, and I mentioned the Viennese Zentrum and my English tisch, and I got a new perspective when I talked about this with them and with survivors in the US, and saw that they had some really mixed feelings about the idea of survivors returning to and living in Vienna. And that just led me forward, realizing this is a question that not just I have. And so already in meeting the survivors and at the Viennese Zentrum, I started to get an idea and a feeling for the idea that they had returned, for this feeling of home. And I was able to get a lot, as far as sources go, I was able to get a lot of context and texture and nuance from oral histories. Thank you very much, Professor Lichtblau, and memoir, and from meeting people and conducting my own interviews too. So coupled with archival documentation. The survivors' memories and their stories themselves were particularly important.
Okay, thank you. Let's go into details. So you mentioned already you were interested, why did survivors go back? So let's talk about the motivations of the group. I also mentioned these are different groups, so it's more nuanced and different between the groups, but nevertheless, there are certain, I would say, patterns as well for motivations to return, and not only to return, to stay in Vienna.
Yeah, I think, first of all, despite a level of anti-Semitism that Jews in Vienna, even before the war, before the Nazis, the level of anti-Semitism that they were used to and had the ability to maneuver and navigate, helped sort of with making a decision that they could feel comfortable or confident going back, that they could once again navigate this in Vienna. I think it had something to do with this confidence or even this thought to return. As you mentioned in your introduction, there are many different kinds of return. When I first started, I was thinking in terms of camp returnees and those coming back from abroad, and the reasons that motivated them to go home. But as I began the research, I quickly realized, yes, of course, exactly what you said. There were some 800 or so Jews who'd hidden in the city and survived for that reason, but also people who had survived in the city protected marriages to non-Jews, or as members of a small Jewish community organization working in the city throughout the war. There were, and people of mixed heritage who found some level of protection and were able to survive the war in the city. So as I looked at returnees overall and found that there were something like waves of returnees coming at different times. The first wave were these people who had actually survived in the city. And that immediately upon the Russian conquest of the city, they returned, they reemerged into this society from which they'd been thrust. And they immediately looked for family in the city and to take care of their basic needs. And as you mentioned, by the end of 45, camp survivors had also come back and had already started trickling in the summer and through the end of the year. And these two groups and sort of waves really largely came because where else to go but a family home, the last place one had been with family, at least to go back and see what one could find and regain. And so these first two waves coming in 45 had come for these family reasons. Shortly after, and somewhat overlapping, came exiles from abroad who had very specific political motivations to come back, to reclaim their Austria, what they saw as their Austria, to rebuild an autonomous democratic state and to regain their political home. Many had been abroad with their parties, that the Social Democrats and Communist parties in exile, where their parties had told them that Austria and Austrians expected them and would welcome them back and wanted them to come back. They were pretty quickly disabused of such idealistic notions, but nonetheless, many stayed and they did take part in rebuilding the country and the political systems. And then the fourth wave that came after them came for this professional home and the motivation of regaining or starting the intended career that they trained for, and specifically, lawyers and doctors who had studied and could be certified in Austrian law or by Austrian medical boards, came back to return to and regain those careers, also languages of reasons of language, and for writers and journalists. these main reasons, and they weren't necessarily totally distinct, they overlapped, but these motivations of family home, political home, and professional home really carried people back.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if we should mention that 2/3 of the Austrian Jews were able to survive because there was such a strong pressure from the Nazis when they occupied Austria in 1938. So, as you know, but maybe that's a difference to other places, especially in Eastern Europe. So we should keep this in mind as well. But I think it's important then that many of them didn't have other options. So I think that's important as well. You mentioned the Jewish remigrant groups. So they came back to in Austria with a population which was indoctrinated by the Nazis for several years, experienced war. There was an endemic anti-Semitism, as you call it, several times. So what did you find out about how the official Austria reacted and, the Austrians, like neighbors, former friends?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, as far as official Austria goes, there was what's referred to, as you know well, as a victim myth that had been in the making already before the end of the war. And that was to cast Austria and Austrians as the first victims of the Nazis and the victims of an aggressive military invasion and occupation of Austria by Nazis. And this language had been used in the Allies' 1943 Moscow Declaration, and it became this national post-war narrative of the experience of Austria, or not at all. It included the idea that in 1938 Austria ceased to exist and therefore could not be held responsible for what they cast as the Germans' crimes, and so that this was the context, sort of the official context to which the returnees came. They also came back to Vienna that had a housing shortage and a food shortage, and returnees were seen as competition for these things. Those who were in possession of Austrian Jews' former property and businesses, their homes, they feared that returning Jews would come back and to demand things to be returned. And on a day-to-day level, returning Austrian Jews confronted with their Gentile neighbors telling them, "Oh, you're so lucky you weren't here. Wherever you were must have been so much better. Why did you even come back? It was horrible here." And the bombs and the air raids. And one woman told me that when she went to her former home, a neighbor said, "What? You're still alive?" And then quickly, reverted to the, "Oh, well, you're so lucky, you weren't here and you missed all of these horrible things." And of course, without any acknowledgement of where she'd been or why she had not been in Vienna. So they returned to a level of denial that was prevalent and with which they were confronted often with this idea, "You're so lucky you weren't here," but also a rooting and a rooted national silence on the war years. And the Gentile neighbors didn't ask and didn't necessarily want to know where their Jewish neighbors had been and what had happened to them. And in turn, if Jewish returnees didn't necessarily want to know what their neighbors had done during the war or how they had felt or perhaps still felt. And so they found some success in regaining and rebuilding lives by taking part in a sort of don't ask, don't tell policy that functioned in a way to protect one from the reality of what had happened and what might still be there underlying this anti-Semitism. The Germans were gone, but not the Nazis or Nazi sentiment, although that was the way that it was cast, that the Germans are gone and the Nazis are gone, but that wasn't true. And anti-Semitism had as one survivor had said, sort of gone subterranean, and it was there, and they knew it was there, but they didn't have to see it. Sometimes they heard things, but more or less taking part in this silence served both parties, both sides well. And one other thing I always thought was interesting too is one of the things that returnees would notice, that in this desire to cast, the crimes to the Germans and what had happened with the Germans was also coupled with sort of a desire to prove that they were un-German. And so Viennese dialect became more prevalent among all socioeconomic classes after the war, in part of this effort, conscious or subconscious effort to not sound German. And one survivor wrote about Tyrolean hats becoming stylish in post-war Vienna, something that you just normally wouldn't see in Vienna, but as a sign of Austrian patriotism and specifically not German. I just thought that was interesting details.
Yeah, I think the Austrian victim myth was very successful. I mean, also from my experience growing up, I was born 54, and if I was hitchhiking in Europe, I never was confronted with that Austria is guilty, but all the German colleagues of my same age, they had really big problems, and were called Nazis and so on. So it changed in Austria in the mid-80s, as everybody knows, when the victim myth collapsed more or less. But it's interesting to experience it, as a person also. And I think the victim myth was very successful because we regard it as ourselves as being very nice, charming, innocent, peace-loving, cosmopolitan, exactly everything which was not correct during the Nazi time. So I think this is very important. And I once did it in my class, and I asked my students in the 90s, what did your grandparents do? Everybody was more or less anti-Nazi. And I just mentioned, okay, just think about it. There is something wrong in the family history, I guess. Okay, so this is another story, but it affects us also until nowadays. Okay, now we have the two groups, Jews, Austrians. I mean, the returnees were a very, very small group, so politically irrelevant because they were too small for elections. The Nazis were very important because they could vote since 1949 again. So can you give us some insights about these strategies of the returnees to get along with this situation? And you mentioned the motivation. So where did they get finally? What is the difference between their hopes when they returned and the real situation living there over the years?
Yeah, well, I think as far as coping and learning to move about and rebuild lives in the society afterwards, first of all, a level of discretion was necessary. It also has to do with what we were talking about with silence and knowing what not to ask or not to push a little bit too much. I would never characterize Viennese Jews as hiding post-war, and that's not what I mean, but they knew the context to which they'd return. And if they didn't know it before they came back, then they knew it quickly soon after they'd arrived. And so this a level of discretion as they were rebuilding lives and for decades after has served them well. And again, this silence that they sort of had to, tacitly agree to take part in. If they didn't ask, as I said, then they didn't have to necessarily know what their neighbors had done or what they thought. I read a really interesting example, interesting in the language employed and in the content, of course, too, of a woman who, it was an interview that had been done in the 80s. So unfortunately, this woman was not one I could interview, but her interviewer asked her about her return and specifically what was the hardest part of her return. And she said that the hardest part was during the Waldheim years and during the Waldheim affair. And it had to do with the kind of very vocal and public anti-Semitism that suddenly came during the Waldheim affair and led to the first time she had to actually hear what her friends and neighbors had to say. And so this is in the mid 80s, she'd lived for decades in Vienna just fine, not asking and not knowing. And at that point, she felt that she needed to cut ties with some of these friends and she lost friendships. But what was most interesting is the way that she was characterizing the most difficult part of return as many decades after return, and also that she just wished the Waldheim affair hadn't happened, because then she wouldn't have had to deal with all of these things and could have continued living a nice post-war life in this sort of willing ignorance that kept her protected and happy.
But I've found interesting in your book that there's a difference between being Austrian and Viennese. So as I mentioned, this is why I mentioned at the beginning that the majority lived in Vienna. So, reclaiming a kind of home is also reclaiming kind of being part of the Austrian we and the Viennese we. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting in the interviews and with the people that I got to meet to hear different variations of this. This idea that of being Viennese and identifying very much as Viennese, in fact, above all else in many cases. But Austria connotes something Hitler and Nazis but Vienna can be Mozart and Sachertorte and opera and wonderful things, and to see the way that they can identify within that, and that it's very specific. Some of the people I spoke with, I wonder how they would speak to you as an Austrian, because you interviewed so many, but they would say, I love Vienna, but the Viennese, or the Austrians, and but they would differentiate and even speak of the city, I think sometimes like a person, like a family member, and also in the way that you would speak of a family member. And I can complain about my brother, but you better not complain about my brother, and to become very defensive and have that sort of conflict of loving and having such difficulties and such problems with the city too. Do you have the same response? I don't know if they were explaining it to me because I'm not Austrian, or.
Well, I did so many interviews all over the world that just one interview came up in Chicago, and she was from Salzburg, and this was in an elderly home, and she said Salzburg would be the most beautiful city in the world without the Salzburgers, so without the people there. I thought this was very convincing, but she never went back, so this is another story. And when I interview, it's always important that I am aware how anti-Semitic the country is. So these are the main messages I will always get along during the interviews. Okay, we have 5 more minutes and then we go into the FMQ session. I wanted to talk to you because Betsy's book is about, very general approaches, like we had the discussion now, and always, interrupted by very individual, examples of people. So I want to ask you, I have two options. One is Erich Lessing, or one is Lucia Heilmann. It's your choice. We can.
I would like to talk about Lucia Holland because I know that you have some insights, as you would about Erich Lessing too, but I would like to hear more about Lucia. Do you want to sketch out her, or shall I sketch out her experience?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Lucia Holland is a survivor who survived in Vienna with her mother, hidden in an artist's metal workshop. And that artist, Mr. Duschka, was her father's good friend. Lucia's father was in Tehran at the time of the Anschluss and was not able to get his wife and daughter out. And so his friend, Mr. Duschka, took responsibility for hiding them in this metal workshop. And then once it had been hit by a bomb, moving them to a coal cellar, which she certainly describes as the hardest part of her wartime experience, because they had to sit in the darkness and complete silence, and it was dangerous because people were coming to get their coal from the coal cellar. I got to read a lot about Lucia, and I got to see her recorded interviews also with you, and but I know that you know her and you met her. I saw her experience as very emblematic and significant in terms of the many interviews I read and did myself, because one of the things that she tended to do was something that many survivors I spoke to tended to do, and that is she would list these experiences of post-war anti-Semitism amongst her teachers and her classmates, and then say specifically, I never felt any anti-Semitism at all. But my mother, she thought everyone was a Nazi, and she saw anti-Semitism everywhere. And then she'd list more of her own experiences and then go back to saying no anti-Semitism. And so I found that a lot in the interviews I read and then people I talked to, that a defense mechanism of understanding that there's no anti-Semitism in post-war Austria, but then also being able to list it. And so I found her to be a very interesting interview subject for that reason. Also, she had such a story to tell. But I know that you knew her and you interviewed her and actually have more insight into Mr. Duschka's experience.
Okay, I just want to share one photo of Lucia Heilmann and her mother, so that we have a person also. This is a photo taken of the liberation, and you can see, I think you can see in her face how the experience was. She was a beautiful kid, and I think she stopped talking in the coal cellar, and I think it was very, very scary for both of them. And on the other side, this is Reinhold Duschka, the person who saved their lives, and he had a workshop, and he was. Lucia Heilmann and her mother wanted that he will become, this writers of the nations by Yad Vashem, and he refused because he was somehow scared that he loses, business. So it took him until he was, I think, 90 years old that he accepted to become this writers among the nations. I think this is symptomatic, about the silence. And Lucia Heilmann only talks because she wants to make sure that Austrians don't forget this person. There only are, I think, more than 110 from Austria and amongst the writers of the nations. Okay, I see that we should go into the FAQ direction. So let me have a look. Okay, there's a a request by Miriam Kaplan. I wonder about the Jewish returnees from other lands. I assume they were not the same people of 1938, but had many more experiences and had changed over the years. In other words, for example, the New York returnees came with the same experience and ideas from the US. Did you find that to be the case?
Well, certainly one of the things that I found with the waves that I described earlier was that the returnees' dates and times of return sort of corresponded with also where they had been and when, therefore, they were able to come back. And so certainly they did come back from different places with different ideas. Many of those who had come back from the UK had come back with their specific wave of these very politically committed returnees, these people that came back for this very political motivation and the rebuilding of the country and the government in such a way that they had been considering and thinking about and in some ways had been indoctrinated about during the war with their parties in exile. So as they came from different places, they often had ended up there for specific reasons and came back with this experience that molded them and their outlooks too. So for sure, yes. Okay,
there's a question by Janet. She maybe needs a clarification. I was confused by the mention of Nazis as a presence in Vienna in 1949. Could you elaborate and explain?
In 1949, I think what I meant to be saying was that essentially, there had certainly been from 38 to 45, many Nazis and committed party members and in Vienna. And once the Nazis were gone, then they didn't necessarily leave as people, just that I maybe should have said former Nazis. But the references to the idea, of course, that after 7 years of being Nazi Vienna, that then the Nazi sentiment and the idea hadn't gone.
Okay, there's a question by Susan. Did some or most returnees get their apartments or business back?
That was one of the things that I found most interesting in digging into this work was, so no, the short answer is no. But what was really interesting is that those people who came back very soon after the end of the war, really before legislation could go into place to handle such things, and especially when people came back right during the first few months when just the Red Army the Soviets were occupying Vienna, some of them got businesses and their homes back in maybe a less formal and a quicker return. It didn't always stick, and sometimes, and once the provisional government went into place and different legislation came up in the following years, some people then lost businesses again or homes. But those very early returnees had more success than those who actually had some sort of legal or political mechanism that should have helped them to regain things.
Okay, there are so many questions. I'm afraid we only can cover a few of them. There's one question by Frida, and she asked, how were the returning Jews able to reclaim a Jewish life, religious, educational, cultural? Maybe we should add something which is really unique in Vienna, that the Jewish community was run by a communist at the beginning. So yeah, it's pretty strange.
Yeah, it was very interesting, because basically for Jews in the city after the war, the Jewish community was really what could support them and help them. And so people were joining the Jewish community that might never have joined before. And just as you said, it was run by the communists for a while. The Allies did support the Jewish community in regaining properties and their institutions, and immediately set to work also with the help of international Jewish organizations and like I said, the support of the Allies, that they were able to start reconstructing, reopening, and putting together a formal Jewish life. That and then there were returnees, people who had lived in Vienna before. There were also DPs that were in the city, and so there was all kinds of interactions and of different groups of people too, not just Viennese Jews, that created a new kind of Jewish life.
There's some questions about the Waldheim affair, so maybe we should explain what it changed in the Austrian narrative and for the group you analyzed.
Yeah. I probably should have said a couple of sentences when I even mentioned it, that Gord Waldheim had been the Secretary General of the UN and had then, after his term, come back to Austria and run for presidency. And during that time, his wartime background came out, and it was clear that he'd been involved in, and at the very least, very knowledgeable about, but had been involved in Nazi war crimes. And it became internationally known, and the kind of criticism that was coming from abroad sort of unleashed this public outcry and newly public anti-Semitic sentiment in Vienna, and not in the middle of the 80s. And so when I said the Waldheim affair, I should have explained more about what that meant. Do you want to add more from your, perspective? And
no, it's very complex. I just want to mention when I asked my students if they know the name Waldheim, they didn't know it anymore. So this is something interesting about history. There's a question by Monica. Did you interview any Viennese returnees who confronted neighbors who now lived in their homes or owned their businesses? If so, what were their reactions? I met people who had gone back to their former homes just to see if anyone was there. I mean, those people who came back really quickly soon after went back hoping that they would find their relatives there, and most did not. Most of them had these experiences where there would be a former neighbor either in the larger building who could comment on what had happened to their apartment and their belongings, or even confronted face to face this whole idea, like, oh, you're so lucky you weren't here. And one of the things that also I thought was interesting, people would come back and there might be a Nazi living in their apartment, but sort of out of practicality, they took advantage of a situation where they could take the apartment downstairs because the Nazi who lived there had fled the Red Army and the apartment was empty. And so I'd read about people like that who just sort of were pragmatic about it and sadly didn't get their apartment back, but got another one. And I don't know, you've interviewed more people than me, Albert. Do you have better or more specific example? I don't want to waste your time now. No, don't worry. Sure, we have many examples about that. There's a question by Janet. Hi. How did returnees impact and change Vienna given these commitments? Maybe I should add that, that we had the Chancellor of Jewish origin, Bruno Kreisky, and you used the Wistrich wording of exonerating Jews. So I think that's also interesting. And, especially, for instance, in Cabaret, we had a lot of Jewish refugees who were very popular.
Yeah.
So this is about commitment on the cultural side, but also on the political side.
Yeah. But I missed the first part of the question, though.
So how did they change the returnees? What did they bring into the country? They had big expectations of a socialist Austria and other things?
I mean, I tried to focus more specifically on, I'm a colleague and friend, Francis Tanzer, who works on these cabaretists that came back and different artists that came back. And I was really, it is fascinating, but I was really focusing much more on sort of everyday people who just wanted to go home and just wanted to be a doctor in Austria again, in Vienna again, or write for a newspaper in the language that they were accustomed to, and as well as being a part of the post-war Communist Party or the Social Democrats, and so Bruno Kreisky obviously does stand out in those terms, and his huge contribution to post-war Austria for many decades. They were the Viennese Jewish returnees that I was looking at came back and took their place as Viennese citizens and professionals and politicians, and took part in Viennese society, and some of them in the Jewish community too. But I think that most important was that they were Viennese and took their place with and among and as Viennese.
Yeah, I like the idea about talking about ordinary people. So as we mentioned already Lucia Holland. I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that she was, as a doctor, worked for school and with children, with this experience as a child, not able to go to school. So, and there's some interesting, little commitment stories as well. We have a final question. I'm so sorry for all the others questions I cannot bring in now by Luisa. What about the next generation, the returned children and grandchildren? Did they typically stay in Vienna or typically leave the country? Or did it come up in your interviews? I'm sure it did.
Yeah, it came up, and certainly a lot of the people I spoke with were sort of lamenting that their grandchildren, so I guess the third generation, had gone abroad, and on one hand being very proud of the big job in Chicago or the grandchild in Tel Aviv, but also that it was clear that there were a number of Austrians sort of my generation that were looking elsewhere for their Viennese Austrian Jews who were looking elsewhere to make their homes and their lives. But it seemed to me that most of the second generation were still there and with their families and raising these children. It wasn't until the third that they started to drift away. But also knowing and seeing that the second generation were raised in this context of discretion and silence that we spoke about before, and that they had also, in a sense, having been raised in that and with that, it was also the third generation that's starting to ask questions and being more open about it and talking and being more out and about.
So we almost come to the end. Thank you, Betsy. And I just want to finish with saying that I highly recommend Betsy's book. It is full of details. It keeps an impressive balance between generalization and categorization without forgetting, and we heard this, the voices of those affected. I want to end myself with a quote that impressed me most in the book. It's from Franziska Tausig. She was a returnee from Shanghai. And by the way, this was the photo taken when she came back to Vienna and was welcomed by Mayor Körner. And she wrote, so she was in Shanghai, lost her husband, her son was in Great Britain and also came back. I was already completely bereft of hope when a young man approached me and said, "Excuse me, madam, but are you perhaps my mother?" This, my son's question, is the end point of my emigration and the beginning of a new phase of life at home. So thank you, Betsy.
Thank you. I'm just very pleased that was able to produce this and add to this examination of post-war history that has really taken hold in the last couple of decades. And I think it's this important part, learning lessons about the Holocaust, but also taking lessons from survivors' experiences and understanding the agency they took in rebuilding and reclaiming lives and the home that they wanted. And the stories of return aren't as widely known as those of survivors who immigrated onward. And I'm just really pleased that I could help contribute to a better understanding of the range of ways survivors responded and concepts of home. So thank you. And thank you, Albert, for doing this with me.
And I thank you both. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Betsy and Albert, for the work each of you does and for your participation in this event. Indeed, many thanks to everyone, speakers and listeners, for joining today. This panel prompts all of us to think anew about many matters, including the meaning of home. So let's continue the conversation in the months to come. Please stay well, everyone. Goodbye.
Goodbye and thank you.
Thank you very much.